The air over the North Pacific was sharp and cold, a crystalline void that promised nothing. For Flight Petty Officer Kenji Tanaka, perched in the cockpit of his Mitsubishi A6M0, it was a familiar emptiness. He scanned the endless blue of the sky, then the churning gray of the ocean below, his gaze finally settling on the 6 carriers of the Kido Butai, the First Air Fleet. They were magnificent, terrible beasts of steel, slicing through the waves in perfect formation. At their heart was his home, the fleet carrier Akagi, her angled flight deck a scar of purpose on the vast canvas of the sea. Below that deck, within her belly, thousands of men lived and worked, a city dedicated to a single violent craft. Kenji was one of its chosen sons, one of the best. He had over 800 hours in the air, a veteran of the skies over China and the stunning success at Pearl Harbor. His hands rested lightly on the controls, the machine an extension of his own body, his spirit fused with its aluminum skin. He felt the familiar thrum of the Sakai engine, a vibration that was more reassuring than a heartbeat. Invincibility was a tangible thing in the spring of 1942. It was the scent of high-octane fuel, the glint of the rising sun on a canopy, the disciplined choreography of the flight deck. He was leading a combat air patrol, a routine sweep of the skies around the fleet. With him were 2 wingmen, younger pilots, their movements in the air still possessing a certain rigidity that only time and terror could smooth away. One of them, a boy named Saito with earnest eyes and a perpetually nervous smile, flew a little too close, a sign of both admiration and inexperience. Kenji tolerated it. They were all brothers here, bound by an oath deeper than blood. He keyed his throat mic. Saito, spread your formation. An American pilot could fly a bomber between us. Keep your eyes open. Yes, Sub-Lieutenant. Saito's voice crackled back, eager and compliant. The Zero peeled away gracefully. Kenji sighed, the sound lost in the engine's roar. He wasn't a sub-lieutenant yet, though the promotion was expected. He was just a man who had seen more than Saito, who understood the brutal arithmetic that lay beneath their Bushido code. The truth was, the Imperial Japanese Navy was a finely crafted sword, honed to an impossibly sharp edge. But even the finest sword could be broken if it struck against an anvil of sufficient size. He had seen the factories of America on a pre-war visit, the endless smokestacks, the rivers of steel. He knew what they were up against. But to speak of such things was to invite scorn. Spirit, they were told, would conquer material. Yamato Damashi. The Japanese spirit was their greatest weapon, an unquantifiable force that would overcome any obstacle. Kenji believed it, he had to. But a nagging voice, a traitorous whisper of logic, sometimes questioned the odds. He had voiced this, once in the coded, respectful language of the junior officer, to Commander Minoru Genda himself, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. They had been in the planning room aboard Akagi, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the sharp scent of ink from the charts. Kenji had pointed to the pilot replacement numbers. Commander, he had said, his voice barely a whisper, our training program is rigorous. It takes 2 years to create a pilot worthy of this fleet. If we suffer heavy losses, how will we replace them? Genda, a man whose gaze could feel like a physical weight, had looked up from his papers. Tanaka, he had said, his voice calm but unyielding, the purpose of a pilot is not to be replaced. It is to win. We do not rotate our best men home to teach. We keep them at the front where their skill is needed. They will be the tip of our spear until victory is achieved. To do otherwise is to blunt our weapon, and that was that. The doctrine was set in stone. Every veteran stayed in combat until he died. Kenji looked at Saito's Zero, a graceful bird against the clouds. The boy was skilled, but he was not a veteran. He had perhaps 200 hours of flight time. If Kenji were to die, Saito could not replace his experience, his intuition, the hundreds of tiny lessons learned in the crucible of combat. And who would replace Saito? The pilots behind him were being rushed through, their training truncated, their hours cut. They were being taught to take off and fight, but the finer points, navigation over open ocean, emergency procedures, the art of landing on a pitching deck in a storm, were being glossed over. Japan was producing maybe 200 new pilots a month. Kenji had heard rumors that America was producing thousands. It was a dark thought, a crack in the mirror of their perceived invincibility. He pushed it away. Today, their duty was to fly, to guard the fleet. Hours later, back in the controlled chaos of the Akagi's ready room, the pilots drank bitter tea and spoke in low tones. The tension was a living thing, a coiling serpent in the gut of every man. The Midway operation was upon them. It was to be the decisive battle, the blow that would shatter the American Pacific Fleet and force them to the negotiating table. The plan was a masterpiece of complexity, a testament to Japanese strategic thinking, but it was also fragile. It depended on surprise, on perfect timing, on the enemy behaving exactly as predicted. Kenji sat with his squadron, cleaning his Nambu pistol, the methodical ritual a comfort. Across from him, Saito was writing a letter, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Another letter to your mother, Saito?" Kenji asked, his voice gentle. Saito looked up, startled. "Yes, Sub-Lieutenant. I tell her of the honor of serving on the Akagi. I tell her we will achieve a great victory. And do you believe that?" "Of course," Saito said, his eyes wide with a faith Kenji almost envied. "We have the best carriers, the best planes, the best pilots. We are invincible." Invincible. The word echoed in the cramped steel room. It was on everyone's lips. But what did it truly mean? Kenji thought of the ship around them. The Akagi was a veteran, converted from a battlecruiser hull. She was fast and packed a powerful punch, capable of carrying over 60 aircraft, with more sometimes crammed into every available space, a practice that always made the deck chiefs nervous. He had walked her passages, explored her depths. He knew her secrets. He knew the ventilation systems were a tangled, confusing maze. He knew the damage control teams were woefully undertrained. Their doctrine was offense, always offense. A damaged ship was expected to keep fighting. Firefighting was a secondary concern, an afterthought. They had buckets, hoses, and a handful of chemical extinguishers. The American carriers, they had heard, had dedicated schools for damage control, where every sailor was drilled relentlessly in the arts of fighting fires and plugging holes. On the Akagi, damage control was a lecture, a diagram, and a prayer. The real defense was the zeros in the sky and the bombs on their way to the enemy. Offensive spirit overcomes material weakness. It was a mantra, a belief system. But Kenji had seen a single stray bullet ignite a fuel leak. He knew how quickly fire could move, how hungry it was for paint, oil, and aviation fuel. He wondered what would happen if a bomb ever found its way into the hangar deck, where the planes were being armed and fueled. The thought was so terrifying he banished it immediately. It was defeatist, unworthy. He snapped the slide on his pistol, the sound sharp and final in the quiet room. The time for doubts was over. The enemy was out there and they were sailing to meet them. The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned clear and bright. A perfect day for flying. A perfect day for killing. Aboard the Akagi, the tension had sharpened to a razor's edge. The flight deck was a whirlwind of orchestrated chaos. Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers, their engines sputtering to life, were lined up wingtip to wingtip. Ground crews in Hachimaki headbands swarmed around them, loading bombs and torpedoes, topping off fuel tanks. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and high-octane gasoline, a heady perfume of impending battle. Kenji Tanaka stood with his squadron of Zero pilots, watching the first wave take off. The roar of the engines was a physical force, pressing against his chest, vibrating through the soles of his boots. One by one, the heavily laden bombers lumbered down the deck and lifted into the sky, their propellers clawing at the air, struggling for altitude before forming up into precise, beautiful formations. They were heading for Midway Island to soften it up for the invasion. It was the opening move in a game of gods. Kenji's squadron was assigned to the second wave, the fleet strike. Their targets would be the American carriers once they were located. Until then, they would wait. Waiting was the hardest part. He climbed into his cockpit, strapping himself in, going through the familiar pre-flight checks. He saw Saito a few planes down, giving a thumbs up to his ground crew. The boy's face was pale, but his eyes shone with a feverish excitement. He was about to taste real combat for the first time. Kenji remembered his own first mission, the way his heart had hammered against his ribs, the cold sweat that had trickled down his spine. He had survived. Many had not. That was the first lesson of war. Survival was not a reward for skill, but a matter of chance. The first wave returned a few hours later, their planes riddled with holes. The attack on Midway had been a success, they reported, but the anti-aircraft fire had been far heavier than anticipated. More disturbingly, they had seen no sign of the American fleet. A sense of unease began to creep through the Akagi. The plan was predicated on finding and destroying the enemy carriers. Where were they? Admiral Nagumo, the fleet commander, now faced a terrible choice. The bombers from the Midway strike were low on fuel and needed to land. The planes on the hangar decks below, including Kenji's, were armed with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for attacking ships. But if enemy planes from Midway attacked the fleet, they would need to launch fighters and bombers armed with fragmentation bombs to defend themselves. The order came down. A cascade of shouted commands and clanging bells. Rearm all aircraft for land attack! Exchange torpedoes for bombs! The hangar deck of the Akagi descended into a frantic, hellish ballet. It was a space never designed for such a task. Japanese carrier doctrine dictated that arming and fueling took place in the enclosed hangar to protect the process from the elements. It was a fatal flaw, a design choice born of peacetime convenience that would prove suicidal in combat. The space was a cavern of steel packed with 90 aircraft where 60 were meant to be. Bombs and torpedoes were stacked precariously on carts. Fuel lines snaked across the floor. The air, already thick with gasoline fumes, grew heavier. Men, sweating and cursing, worked with desperate speed. They wrestled the massive Type 91 torpedoes from the bellies of the Kates, replacing them with 800-kilogram land bombs. The torpedoes, each one a delicate and powerful instrument of war, were not returned to the armored magazines. There was no time. They were simply stacked against the hangar walls. It was a violation of every safety protocol, but speed was paramount. Kenji, waiting on the flight deck, could feel the vibrations of the frenzied work below him. He watched the sky, his eyes scanning the horizon. He trusted his leaders. He trusted the plan. But something felt wrong. The clock was ticking, and with every passing minute, the unseen enemy was a step closer. Then, a scout plane, long overdue, broke radio silence. Enemy carriers spotted. The message electrified the bridge. A wave of relief and renewed purpose washed over the fleet. The gamble had paid off. The enemy was found. Immediately, the previous order was countermanded. Halt rearming! Rearm all planes for anti-ship attack! Reload torpedoes! The chaos in the hangar deck doubled. The exhausted crews, who had just finished hauling bombs into place, now had to reverse the entire process. They began removing the land bombs and wrestling the torpedoes back onto the bombers. The hangar became a tinderbox, a powder keg waiting for a spark. It was filled with aircraft brimming with fuel, surrounded by stacks of high-explosive bombs and torpedoes, all bathed in a fog of gasoline vapor. The ship's ventilation system, a primitive network of ducts, did nothing to clear the fumes. In fact, it efficiently circulated the volatile mixture throughout the lower decks. No one understood the danger. They had never been trained to. Their training was in launching aircraft quickly, in hitting their targets, in dying for the Emperor. Fighting a fire inside the steel guts of their home was an abstract concept. Suddenly, the air raid siren shrieked. A lookout had spotted them. American dive bombers, high in the sun, almost invisible. Kenji's heart leaped into his throat. He saw them, tiny specks growing larger at an impossible speed, glinting as they tipped over into their attack runs. They were coming straight down, a torrent of vengeance from the heavens. Launch the fighters! The cry went up, but it was too late. The flight deck was still cluttered with bombers being moved to the elevators. Kenji and his fellow Zero pilots were trapped in their cockpits, helpless spectators to their own fate. He watched, frozen, as the first Douglas SBD Dauntless screamed down towards the carrier Kaga. He saw the black shape of the bomb detach. He saw the plume of smoke and fire erupt from the Kaga's flight deck. Then another, and another. The ship, a few hundred meters away, seemed to stagger, consumed by a series of massive explosions. Black smoke, thick and oily, billowed into the sky. Then it was their turn. The sky above the Akagi filled with diving planes. The ship's anti-aircraft guns, aimed manually by gunners tracking 400-mile-per-hour targets by eye, opened up with a frantic, desperate roar. Their hit probability was less than 2%. It was mathematical suicide. Kenji gripped his controls, his knuckles white. There was nowhere to go, nothing to do but watch. He saw a bomb fall, tumbling end over end. It seemed to hang in the air for an eternity. It wasn't heading for him, but for the center of the ship, right over the massive deck elevator. It struck with a sickening crunch of metal. It wasn't a massive explosion, not at first. Just a cloud of gray smoke. But Kenji knew what was below that spot. The hangar deck. The hangar deck filled with fuel, bombs, and torpedoes. A deep, gut-wrenching shudder ran through the entire ship. A low growl emanated from its depths, the sound of a beast mortally wounded. Kenji felt a wave of heat wash over his cockpit. Then, a secondary explosion, far more powerful than the first, blew the deck elevator into the air like a discarded toy. It shot upwards, twisting, and crashed onto the flight deck. A column of incandescent orange flame erupted from the hole, a raging furnace from the heart of the ship. The offensive spirit of the Akagi was meeting the material reality of 1,000 gallons of aviation fuel and 50,000 pounds of ordnance igniting in a confined space. The battle had just begun, but for the men on the Japanese carriers, the war was already lost. They just hadn't started dying yet. The world dissolved into a symphony of destruction. The first bomb that struck the Akagi acted not as a killer, but as a key, unlocking a Pandora's box of horrors that the ship's designers had so carelessly prepared. It plunged through the flight deck and exploded in the upper hangar, directly amidst the fully armed and fueled Kate bombers being prepared for the strike against the American carriers. The initial blast was devastating, shredding aircraft and men alike, but it was the chain reaction that followed that turned the carrier into a crematorium. The concussion ruptured the fuel lines of a dozen nearby planes. Atomized aviation gasoline, far more volatile than liquid, filled the air. A split second later, the stacked torpedoes and bombs, left carelessly on the hangar floor, began to cook off. The hangar deck, the very heart of the carrier's offensive power, transformed into a blast furnace. For the men trapped inside, there was no escape. The blast wave, compressed by the steel walls, was a physical hammer blow that pulped organs and shattered bones. It was followed by a tidal wave of fire that consumed everything in its path. The neatly arranged aircraft, moments before the pride of the Imperial Navy, became sources of unimaginable destruction. Their fuel tanks erupted, their ordnance detonated, each plane contributing to the growing inferno. The fires fed on the gasoline vapors that the ventilation system had so diligently spread throughout the ship. Passageways and compartments far from the initial impact suddenly exploded in flame, cutting off escape routes and trapping hundreds of sailors in darkness and searing heat. On the flight deck, Kenji Tanaka was thrown against the side of his cockpit as the ship convulsed. The heat was immense, blistering the paint on his Zero. He watched in horror as flames, thick and greasy with fuel, shot hundreds of feet into the air from the gaping wound where the elevator had been. The screams of men, high and thin against the roar of the fire, were barely audible, but he felt them in his soul. He saw his wingman, Saito, trying to unstrap himself from his cockpit. A look of pure, uncomprehending terror was etched on the young pilot's face. The deck beneath them was beginning to warp, the steel plates glowing a dull cherry red. Below decks, it was a descent into hell. Damage control teams, armed with little more than a fierce belief in their own spirit, were annihilated before they could even react. Buckets were useless against a fire fed by thousands of gallons of fuel. Hoses produced pathetic streams of water that vaporized instantly on contact with the superheated steel. There was no central command for damage control, no organized resistance. There was only chaos and death. Men ran through smoke-filled corridors, their lungs burning, their paths lit by the lurid glow of the fires. Watertight doors, which might have contained the inferno, were either jammed by the force of the explosions or left open in the confusion. The crew simply didn't know what to do. They had been trained to attack, not to save themselves. Kenji knew he had to get out of his plane. The Zero was a metal coffin, its own fuel tanks a bomb waiting to explode. He finally managed to release his harness and scrambled out onto the burning deck. The air was a shimmering wall of heat. He grabbed Saito's arm, pulling the dazed pilot from his cockpit. "We have to jump!" Kenji screamed over the din. The sea, 100 feet below, seemed a terrifying distance away. but the deck was no longer an option. All around them, aircraft were exploding, sending shrapnel scything through the air. The ship was beginning to list, its movement sluggish and heavy like a dying animal. Together, they ran to the edge of the flight deck. Kenji didn't hesitate. He pulled Saito with him and they leaped into the void. The impact with the water was like hitting concrete. The cold was a shocking, brutal embrace after the inferno of the ship. Kenji surfaced, gasping, his lungs aching. He looked for Saito and saw him floundering nearby, his face a mask of pain. The boy had broken his leg in the fall. Kenji swam to him, pulling him onto a piece of floating wreckage. From the water, they had a panoramic view of the death of their world. The Akagi, his home for 3 years, was a funeral pyre. Flames licked up her island superstructure. Black smoke poured from her, a vast, malevolent plume that stained the perfect blue sky. But she was not alone. In the distance, the Kaga was an even more horrific sight, burning from stem to stern, consumed by an uncontrollable firestorm. The Soryu, hit shortly after, had also vanished into a column of smoke and flame. 3 fleet carriers, the core of the Kido Butai, effectively destroyed in the space of less than 10 minutes. It was inconceivable. It was impossible. Yet it was happening. A survivor from the carrier Shokaku would later describe a similar scene. The American dive bombers came from the sun. 3 bombs, that's all. 3 bombs, and 20 minutes later our carrier was gone. 1,360 men. The water was on fire. Those who escaped the ship burned in the ocean. Kenji was now seeing the truth of that statement. The sea around the dying Akagi was covered in a thick layer of oil and fuel leaking from her ruptured tanks. And it was on fire. Patches of the ocean itself were burning, creating a hellish landscape of flaming water and black smoke. Men who had jumped from the ship were now trapped, forced to swim through fire. Their screams were the sounds of the damned. Kenji held on to Saito, trying to paddle their small piece of debris away from the flames. But the current was pulling them closer to the burning ship. He looked at the face of his admiral, Nagumo, who remained on the bridge of the stricken Akagi, paralyzed by the sheer speed and totality of the disaster. His offensive spirit, his belief in the Yamato Damashi, had been vaporized by a handful of well-aimed 1,000-pound bombs. His meticulously crafted plan had shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The doctrine of offensive spirit overcoming material weakness had been put to the ultimate test, and the result was a floating inferno. The Japanese carriers were not just ships. They were complex weapon systems. But they were also death traps by design. Their greatest strength, the ability to pack a massive offensive punch, was also their greatest vulnerability. By arming and fueling in enclosed hangars, by neglecting damage control, by believing that fighting spirit alone could ward off bombs, the Imperial Navy had engineered its own destruction. At Midway, the bill for that hubris had come due. For Kenji Tanaka, floating in the burning sea and holding a wounded comrade, the only thought was one of utter, soul-crushing despair. The gods of war had not just abandoned them. They had laughed at their folly. The night offered no relief, only a different shade of terror. The vast, indifferent blackness of the Pacific was punctuated by a single horrific beacon, the burning hulk of the carrier Hiryu. She was the last of the 4, the sole survivor of the morning's Holocaust. Her commander, Rear Admiral Taemon Yamaguchi, was a man carved from the very essence of the Bushido Code. In a staggering act of defiance, he had gathered his remaining aircraft and launched a counterstrike. His pilots, flying with a cold, vengeful fury, had found the American carrier USS Yorktown and left it a burning wreck. It was a moment of fleeting, desperate triumph in a day of unparalleled disaster. But vengeance came at a cost. The returning Japanese planes led the American hunters straight back to the Hiryu. Just as the sun was setting, the dive bombers had appeared again, like specters of doom against the orange sky. They had hit the Hiryu with 4 bombs, and her fate was sealed. Now, she burned. Kenji and Saito, still clinging to their piece of wreckage, watched the distant fire for hours. The flames were a flickering, demonic light on the horizon, a constant reminder of their loss. The cold of the water had seeped deep into their bones, a creeping lethargy that threatened to pull them under. Saito was fading. His broken leg was a source of agonizing, unrelenting pain, and he drifted in and out of consciousness. His words, a feverish jumble of apologies to his mother and memories of his home. Kenji held him tight, talking to him, trying to keep the spark of life from being extinguished by the cold and the pain. "Stay with me, Saito," he murmured, his own voice hoarse, his throat raw from salt water. "They will look for us. The destroyers will come." But as the hours dragged on, the hope began to die. The sea was a graveyard. All around them, dark shapes bobbed in the water, debris, empty life rafts, and the bodies of their comrades. The scale of the loss was biblical. At Midway, Japan didn't just lose 4 carriers and over 300 aircraft. They lost 110 veteran pilots, men like Kenji, men with years of training, men who could navigate by the stars and land a metal bird on a moving sliver of steel in a storm. They were the irreplaceable core of naval aviation, and in a single day, a huge part of that core had been annihilated. Japan could build new ships, it could manufacture new planes, but it could not mass-produce experience. It could not conjure veterans out of thin air. The brutal arithmetic that Kenji had once feared was now a terrifying reality. Sometime after midnight, the distant glow of the Hiryu was extinguished by a series of massive underwater explosions. Admiral Yamaguchi, choosing to die with his ship, had been lashed to the bridge. The last carrier of Nagumo's fleet was gone. A profound, crushing silence fell over the ocean. The war had turned, the tide had gone out, and it had taken their world with it. Just before dawn, Saito died. It was a quiet passing. One moment he was muttering about cherry blossoms in his village. The next, he was still. His head lolled back, and the light left his eyes. Kenji held the boy's body for a long time, the warmth slowly leaching out of it, leaving nothing but a cold, empty shell. He had failed him. He, the veteran, the leader, had failed to protect the young pilot who had looked at him with such admiration. He gently untangled himself from Saito's grasp and let the boy's body slip into the deep. He said a silent prayer, a farewell to a life cut short, another number in a catastrophic equation. He was alone now, a single speck in an infinite ocean. The sun rose, painting the sky in hues of pink and orange, a beautiful, cruel mockery of the hell he had endured. His thirst was a torment, his hunger a dull ache. But worse than the physical suffering was the mental anguish. He saw the faces of the men he had served with, the pilots, the mechanics, the cooks, the gunners. 25,000 men had served on the carriers of the Kido Butai. How many were left? He thought of the hangar deck on the Akagi. The survivors had said it became a blast furnace in seconds. 711 men had died on the Kaga in just 9 minutes. On the Soryu, the dead were so numerous they were never accurately counted. He thought of the flawed designs, the criminal lack of training in damage control, the insane doctrine of stacking explosives in an unarmored, unventilated room. It wasn't combat that had killed them. It was their own philosophy. They had committed industrial seppuku, ritual suicide on a massive scale. He drifted for what felt like an eternity. The sun beat down on him, blistering his skin. Sharks began to circle, their fins cutting ominously through the water. He had his Nambu pistol, but it was useless, soaked in salt water. He was losing hope, preparing himself for the end when he saw it. A smudge on the horizon. A ship. It was a Japanese destroyer, one of the screening vessels, scouring the seas for survivors. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through him. He waved his arms, shouting until his throat was raw. The ship saw him. It changed course. As he was hauled aboard, a wretched, sunburnt creature, half dead and delirious, he looked into the faces of his rescuers. They were grim, their eyes hollowed out by the disaster. A young officer handed him a cup of water, the sweetest thing he had ever tasted. "We have found very few," the officer said, his voice heavy with grief. Very few. Kenji Tanaka had survived. He was one of the 9%. But as he stood on the deck of the destroyer, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket, watching the empty ocean where the most powerful carrier fleet in the world had once sailed, he felt no relief. He had not been saved. He had merely been condemned to watch the rest of his nation follow his friends into the abyss. The war was not over, but the dream of victory had died in the flames of Midway. From now on, every mission would be a suicide mission. They just hadn't started calling them that yet. The years that followed Midway were a long, slow descent into a hell of Japan's own making. Kenji Tanaka, one of the handful of veteran pilots to be fished from the oily waters, was not sent home to teach. The doctrine, born of arrogance and desperation, held firm. He was given a new Zero, assigned to a new carrier, and sent back into the fight. But everything had changed. The swagger and confidence of the Kido Butai was gone, replaced by a grim, fatalistic determination. The new carriers, built with frantic speed, were not the proud veterans of Pearl Harbor. They were flawed, rushed into service, their crews green and their pilots barely trained. Kenji found himself flying alongside boys who had less than 50 hours of flight time, some of whom had practiced carrier landings on crude outlines painted on the ground. To save fuel, much of their training had been in gliders. They were brave, filled with a burning patriotism, but in the sky, they were lambs being led to the slaughter. They lacked the intuition, the sixth sense for aerial combat that only hundreds of hours in the cockpit could bestow. Kenji would watch them die, watch them fall for the simplest American tricks, watch them get lost over the open ocean, their fuel running out as they searched in vain for a home that was no longer there. He became a ghost, a relic of a bygone era of invincibility. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944 was the final brutal proof of the failed doctrine. The Americans called it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. For Kenji, it was the day the soul of Japanese naval aviation was extinguished forever. He flew from the deck of the brand-new carrier Taiho, the pride of the fleet, supposedly an improvement on the older designs. The battle was a massacre. The new Japanese pilots, flying into the teeth of American formations guided by radar and protected by a curtain of anti-aircraft fire from guns that were radar-directed, were slaughtered. Their hit probability was near zero. The American F-6F Hellcats, flown by pilots with over 300 hours of training, tore them from the sky. The kill ratio was 13-1. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Japan lost nearly 400 aircraft and 450 pilots. Only 43 were rescued. America lost 29 planes, and then there were the carriers themselves. The Taiho, his new home, was hit by a single torpedo from an American submarine. The damage was not severe. A veteran crew on a well-designed ship would have saved her. But the Taiho's crew was inexperienced. They did not know to shut down the ventilation systems. For 6 agonizing hours, aviation fuel vapors from a ruptured tank spread silently throughout the ship. The crew went about their duties, unaware that they were living inside a 27,000-ton bomb. Then a single spark. The resulting explosion was catastrophic, ripping the carrier apart from the inside. 6 hours after being hit by one torpedo, the Pride of the Navy sank, taking 1,650 men with her. That same day, the veteran carrier Shokaku was also sunk by a submarine. Her fires raging out of control due to the same lack of effective damage control that had doomed the carriers at Midway. Kenji had been in the air when the Taiho exploded. He had circled the pillar of smoke, his heart a cold, dead stone in his chest. For the second time in his life, he had watched his home burn and sink beneath the waves. This time there was no rescue. He was forced to fly to another carrier, a refugee in the sky. He had survived again, but survival now felt like a curse. The final act of the tragedy was the story of the Shinano. She was the largest aircraft carrier ever built, a behemoth of 72,000 tons, converted from the hull of a Yamato-class battleship. She was the secret weapon, the last great hope of the Imperial Navy. On her maiden voyage, still incomplete, with a crew of shipyard workers and untrained sailors. She was found by a single American submarine, the USS Archerfish. 4 torpedoes struck her. The crew, in a panic, did not know how to operate the damage control equipment. They failed to close the watertight doors. The pumps were not properly installed. For 7 hours, the unsinkable ship slowly, inexorably filled with water and capsized. She sank on her first voyage, taking 1,435 souls with her. The pride of the Japanese Navy, a symbol of their industrial might, sank because nobody had taught the crew how to close a door. By 1945, the Japanese carrier fleet was a ghost. The ships that remained were often converted merchant vessels or cruisers, their flight decks too short for conventional landings. They became one-way launch platforms for a new, terrible weapon, the kamikaze. Kenji, his body and spirit broken, refused. He would not fly to his death for a war that was already lost. For his defiance, he was grounded, relegated to a training squadron in the homeland, forced to watch as teenagers with barely 30 hours of flight time were sent out in bomb-laden planes on missions from which they would never return. Their job was not to fight, but simply to die. Survival was no longer part of the mission profile. The last operational carrier, the Amagi, never saw a plane. She was destroyed at anchor in her home port by American aircraft. Her crew was still aboard, waiting for pilots who did not exist, for aircraft that would never come, fighting a war that had been decided years earlier by mathematics. It was decided by the fact that America built 90 carriers while Japan built 7. It was decided by the fact that America produced 2,500 pilots a month, while Japan produced 200. It was decided by the fact that Japanese doctrine was built on a fanatical belief in spirit, while American doctrine was built on industrial capacity, relentless training, and radar. When the war ended, Kenji Tanaka was one of only 112 trained carrier pilots who had been serving in 1941 to still be alive. Over 3,500 had started the war. 91% were dead. The carriers that had revolutionized naval warfare and brought Japan to the pinnacle of its power had become steel coffins for 25,000 sailors. They had not lost a war. They had, through a series of fatal choices in design, doctrine, and training, committed suicide. Kenji lived out his days in a quiet fishing village, a man haunted by the ghosts of the empty sky and the burning sea. The last witness to how an entire naval culture, in its glorious, terrible pride, had been consumed by its own fire.